Millions of Americans have a photograph of themselves sitting on their mother's lap, taken inside a Sears store. Almost none of them know the man who ran that camera didn't work for Sears at all. For 70 years, families put on their best clothes, drove to the mall, and walked past the tools section and the appliance aisles to reach a small studio tucked near the back of the store. A cardboard backdrop of autumn leaves, a stuffed bear on a stool, a photographer counting down, say cheese. Grandmothers carried the results in their wallets until the paper wore soft at the corners. Then in April 2013, without a single warning to employees or customers, nearly 2,000 of these studios went dark in a single week. How does something that touched almost every American family simply vanish overnight with no announcement and no goodbye? This is the story of the company nobody knew they were trusting with their most treasured moments, and how it disappeared. In 1942 in St. Louis, Missouri, a man named Milford Boehm opened a small photography studio and gave it a name meant to promise something grand: Rembrandt Studio. America was at war. Film was rationed, silver was scarce, and most photographers were either overseas with the army or struggling to keep their shops open. Boehm saw something the rest of the industry had missed. Families didn't need a masterpiece. They needed a memory. Something to send to a son in the Pacific, something to hang above the mantle while half the men in the neighborhood were gone. A simple, affordable portrait, done well, done fast, done for people who had never set foot in a photography studio in their lives. Boehm's original shop was modest: a single room, a backdrop, a camera, and a promise. But he didn't wait for customers to come to him. He built his business on the road. He would hire a young man, hand him a camera and a car, and send him out into the small towns of the Midwest with nothing but a list of counties and a tank of gasoline. Weeks would pass, sometimes a year. The traveling photographer would set up in a church basement, a Grange hall, a hotel lobby, wherever people were willing to sit still for a few minutes and pay for the results. He photographed farm families in their Sunday clothes, babies on quilts, newlyweds who couldn't afford a proper wedding photographer. For a country still recovering from the Depression and now consumed by war, a Rembrandt studio portrait was often the only photograph a family would own of a particular year, a particular child, a particular face that might not come home. The formula worked because it solved a problem nobody else was solving. Established photography studios were expensive, formal, and concentrated in big cities. Boehm brought the studio to the customer, and he made the price low enough that a factory worker or a farmer could justify it. By the late 1950s, what had started as one man with a camera in St. Louis had grown into 20 Rembrandt studios, stretching from Wichita, Kansas, all the way to York, Pennsylvania. A footprint that mirrored the heartland itself. What made Boehm's vision different wasn't the equipment or the lighting technique. It was the belief, unusual for its time, that a portrait wasn't a luxury reserved for the wealthy. It was something every family deserved, and something every family could be talked into paying for, if the price was right and the photographer came to them instead of the other way around. That belief, accessible portraiture for ordinary Americans, would outlive Boehm's original shop by decades, carried forward by a young accountant who joined the company in the mid-1950s and would eventually turn Boehm's traveling cameraman into a nationwide institution, one that would find its true home inside the biggest retailer in America. By the 1970s and through the 1980s, the small chain Milford Boehm had built from a single St. Louis storefront had transformed into something far bigger than photography. It had become a ritual. Under the leadership of Alan Essman, who had joined the company as a young controller in 1956 and taken the top job by the early 1970s, the business, now called CPI, struck a partnership with Sears that would define it for the next 40 years. Sears did not just rent CPI a corner of its stores. It gave portrait photography a permanent address inside the most trusted retail name in America, and CPI filled that space with a promise. Walk in, sit down, and walk out with your family frozen in time, all before lunch. For millions of American families, especially those raising children between 1975 and 2005, the Sears Portrait Studio became an unspoken part of the calendar. There was the fall session, timed so the pictures would be ready for Christmas cards, mailed to relatives in other states. There was the school-age sitting, where a mother wrestled a squirming 5-year-old into a collared shirt that had been ironed the night before. There was the newborn session, the engagement photo, the "we finally got everyone together" family reunion portrait that 4 siblings had been arguing about scheduling for a month. None of these were extravagant occasions. That was the entire point. A trip to Sears for a portrait sat somewhere between an errand and an event, ordinary enough that a family could afford to do it every year, special enough that everyone dressed up for it anyway. The studio itself became instantly recognizable to anyone who grew up in this era. A hallway near the appliance department, or just past the tire center, led to a small waiting area with a few chairs and a rack of framed samples. Inside, the set rotated with the seasons. A soft blue backdrop for spring, an autumn leaf scene for October, a set of oversized wrapped presents for the weeks before Christmas. A stuffed animal sat on a stool to catch a toddler's attention. The photographer, usually young, often working a second job to get through college, would crouch, snap fingers, whistle, and repeat the same line dozens of times a day. "Look right here, 1, 2, 3. Then came the wait in the lobby while the prints developed, and finally the moment every parent remembers. Flipping through the proof sheets, trying to find the one shot where nobody blinked and the baby wasn't crying. Sears understood exactly what this arrangement did for its stores. A portrait appointment brought a family through the doors on a Saturday morning, and a family already inside a Sears store was a family walking past the tool aisle, the appliance floor, the children's clothing racks. CPI's studios were never advertised as a profit center on their own. They were a magnet, pulling foot traffic toward everything else Sears sold. By the height of this partnership, CPI operated more than 1,000 studios across the United States and Canada, and the overwhelming majority of them sat inside Sears stores specifically, a number that made it, by volume, one of the largest portrait photography operations that had ever existed anywhere in the world. Employees who worked the studios in these decades often described the job in the same terms: chaotic, exhausting during the holiday rush, and strangely meaningful. A photographer might shoot 40 family sessions in a single Saturday, coaxing smiles out of overtired toddlers and impatient teenagers dragged along by their mothers. But those same employees also remember mothers crying at the proof counter when they saw a grandparent's last portrait before they passed away, or a young couple returning years later with their own children to sit in front of the same backdrop. The studio became, without anyone officially designing it that way, a place where a community's memory accumulated one Saturday morning at a time. Television and print advertising leaned hard into this emotional territory. Sears ran seasonal campaigns built around the phrase, "capture the moment," timing the pushes to coincide with back-to-school season and the weeks before Thanksgiving, when photographs needed to be ready in time for holiday cards. Newspaper inserts advertised limited-time portrait packages, a certain number of prints, a certain number of poses, all for a fixed and affordable price. The same loss leader logic Milford Boehm had used decades earlier with his traveling cameraman, now refined into a nationwide marketing machine. Generation after generation walked through the same doors. A mother who had her own kindergarten portrait taken at Sears in 1968 would bring her own child to the same chain in 1994, standing in front of a set that looked almost identical to the one from her own childhood. What made the Sears Portrait Studio nearly impossible to replace wasn't the photography itself. Professional photographers existed all over every American town. It was the accessibility, the consistency, and the way it had wired itself into the emotional architecture of an ordinary year. Was there any other business in America that so quietly, so reliably became the keeper of a family's most important faces? Nobody walking out of that studio with a fresh set of proofs in the 1980s or 1990s could have imagined that within a generation, the very thing that made the studio necessary, a family's need for someone else to take their picture, would begin to quietly disappear. The growth that carried CPI from a regional Midwestern chain into a national institution did not happen by accident, and it did not happen quietly. When Alan Essman took the reins of the company in the early 1970s, he inherited roughly 400 Sears locations in an ambition that his corporate parent at the time, the sprawling conglomerate Chromaloy American, was reluctant to fund. Essman wanted to expand faster than Chromalloy was willing to invest, and year after year, his growth plans ran into resistance from executives more focused on other parts of their business empire. Chromalloy itself was in upheaval following the death of its founder in 1977, leaving less appetite than ever for backing an ambitious photography subsidiary. Essman, tired of asking permission to grow, made a decision that would define the next 3 decades of the company's history. In 1979, Essman and 10 other CPI executives pooled together roughly $1 million in cash and raised an additional $6 million in preferred stock to buy the company outright from Chromalloy. It was a management buyout, unusual for its scale in an industry as unglamorous as portrait photography, and it gave Essman exactly what he had been fighting for: total control over how fast and how far CPI would expand. Freed from a parent company that saw it as a minor asset, CPI began opening Sears locations at a pace it had never managed before, pushing past 400 stores and climbing steadily through the 1980s toward the 1,000-location mark it would eventually reach. The engine driving this expansion was not the Sears retail model as most people understood it. There were no franchise owners in the traditional sense, no individual entrepreneurs buying into a territory the way a fast food franchisee might. CPI operated its studios directly as a company-run concession, embedded inside Sears real estate under the terms of an exclusive nationwide agreement. This meant consistency was easier to enforce than in a typical franchise system. The same seasonal backdrops, the same pricing structure, the same 1, 2, 3, look right here script that photographers across the country were trained to deliver, whether the store set in suburban Ohio or downtown Sacramento. Every new Sears store that opened during this era was, in effect, a new CPI studio waiting to happen, and Sears itself had every incentive to make sure that happened as smoothly as possible. But the same buyout pricing model that had powered CPI since Milford Bohm's traveling photographer days was now being scaled to a size Bohm never could have imagined, and the cracks in the economics were already visible to anyone paying close attention. CPI lured customers in with a rock-bottom advertised package, then made its real money by selling additional prints, larger frames, and add-on sittings once the family was already seated and looking at their proofs. It worked well enough at 400 stores. At 1,000 stores, the company was discovering that too many customers were simply taking the cheap deal and walking away. In 1979 alone, the average customer spent only $14, and those who took nothing but the advertised loss leader spent barely $1. Essman moved quickly to correct this, eliminating the rock-bottom bargain package entirely and restructuring pricing to push customers toward higher-value sittings, a change that increased revenue almost immediately. For the young photographers hired to staff this rapidly growing network, expansion meant opportunity, but a particular kind of opportunity. The job paid modestly, turnover was constant, and the work was physically demanding, especially during the crushing weeks before Christmas when a single studio might process dozens of families in a day. Many who took the job were college students or young parents themselves, drawn by flexible scheduling rather than any deep passion for photography. Corporate leadership, meanwhile, began looking past the camera altogether. Flush with the confidence of a business that had grown from 400 stores to nearly 1,000 in little more than a decade, CPI started using Sears' own advice to diversify into services that had nothing to do with portraits at all: carpet cleaning, upholstery cleaning, even office telephone systems. A hint, even at the height of its success, that the leadership sensed a portrait-only business might not be enough to lean on forever. By the time CPI's studio count approached its peak, the company had achieved something almost no one in the photography industry had managed before: a footprint so vast and so deeply wired into the daily geography of Sears itself that for an entire generation of Americans, taking your family's picture and going to Sears had become, quite literally, the same errand. By the mid-1980s, CPI's partnership with Sears had reached a scale that made it, by volume, one of the largest portrait photography operations the world had ever seen. More than 1,000 studios across the United States and Canada, with the overwhelming majority sitting inside Sears stores, under the terms of an exclusive agreement that had already lasted more than a decade. This was the peak. The Sears Portrait Studio was no longer simply a service tucked near the appliance department. It had become a fixture of American family life, as expected and as unremarkable as the school photographer who showed up every September, except this one operated 365 days a year in nearly every state in the country. What it meant to be an employee at the height of this era was a strange mix of monotony and quiet significance. A photographer working the Saturday shift before Christmas might shoot family after family for 8 straight hours, resetting the same backdrop, repeating the same countdown, adjusting the same stuffed bear on the same stool between sittings. It was exhausting, repetitive work, and yet those same photographers often remember individual families decades later. The toddler who refused to stop crying until her father made a ridiculous face just out of frame. The elderly couple who came in every single year without fail. The young mother who broke down at the proof counter because it was the last portrait she would ever take with her father, who died 3 months later. The volume of the business never diminished the weight of what it was actually capturing. Television advertising captured this cultural saturation directly. Sears leaned into seasonal campaigns that positioned the portrait studio not as a photography service, but as a piece of the American calendar itself. Timed deliberately around back-to-school season, in the weeks before Thanksgiving, when families needed prints ready in time to tuck inside a Christmas card. Newspaper inserts nationwide advertised limited-time portrait packages using almost the exact same loss leader logic Milford Boehm had pioneered decades earlier, with a single traveling cameraman and a tank of gasoline, now deployed at a scale that reached tens of millions of households every autumn. What made this moment different from any earlier point in the company's history was the arrival of something Boehm and even Espin's earliest years could never have counted on: repeat customers across generations. A woman who had her own kindergarten photo taken inside a Sears store in 1968 might, 26 years later, bring her own daughter to sit in front of a backdrop that looked almost identical, using a pricing structure that would have felt familiar to her own mother. Grandparents brought grandchildren. Parents who had grown up with the ritual passed it down without a second thought, the same way they passed down where to buy school shoes or where to get the car's oil changed. The Sears Portrait Studio had become, without any single marketing campaign designed to make it so, an inherited family habit, and it was not simply a private, in-store phenomenon. Sears positioned itself, and by extension, CPI's studios, as a civic presence in the towns where its stores operated, sponsoring local school fundraisers, participating in Chamber of Commerce events, donating portrait sittings to charity auctions and church raffles. In small and mid-sized American towns where the Sears store anchored the local mall, the portrait studio inside it was simply understood to be part of the community's infrastructure, no different in permanence from the post office or the public library. Families did not think of it as a business relationship. They thought of it as simply where you went. This was the high watermark, the moment the business had been building toward since Milford Boehm sent a young man out into rural Kansas with nothing but a camera and a car. Was there any other company in America, in any industry, that had managed to become this quietly, this completely woven into the private, sentimental moments of so many millions of families, without most of those families even knowing its name? Nobody sitting for a portrait in 1985, dressed in their best clothes, waiting for the photographer to say 1, 2, 3, had any reason to imagine that within 2 decades, the very habit that made this business essential, a family's need for someone else to hold the camera, would begin to quietly, almost invisibly come apart. Nobody standing in line at a Sears Portrait Studio in the early 1990s noticed anything was wrong. The waiting area was still full on Saturday mornings. The seasonal backdrop still rotated on schedule. Photographers were still counting down 1, 2, 3 to squirming toddlers exactly as they had for 20 years. But inside the industry, and eventually inside CPI's own boardroom, a quiet shift was already underway, one that would take more than a decade to fully reveal itself. The first real threat came from something almost too ordinary to notice: the point-and-shoot camera. Throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, Compact 35mm cameras became cheap enough and simple enough that any parent could take a passable photo of their own child without driving to a mall and waiting for an appointment. It didn't replace the formal portrait right away. A father with a home camera still couldn't replicate professional lighting, a proper backdrop, or the ability to coax a genuine smile out of a 3-year-old. But it planted a seed. Families began to ask themselves quietly and without any single dramatic moment whether every occasion actually required a trip to the studio, or whether some of them could simply be captured at home. CPI's own response to this shift revealed a company that sensed trouble before it could name it precisely. Rather than doubling down on innovation within photography itself, the company spent much of the late 1980s and 1990s diversifying into businesses that had nothing to do with portraits at all. It expanded into residential carpet cleaning. It moved into upholstery cleaning. It acquired a small firm that sold office telephone systems, a venture so far removed from photography that longtime employees struggled to explain the logic behind it. These moves were framed publicly as smart diversification, a customer service company broadening its offerings rather than a photography chain expanding sideways. But diversification of this kind, chasing revenue in businesses a company barely understood, is often what a company does when it senses, even subconsciously, that its core business has a ceiling it cannot see past. Then came the real disruption, arriving not gradually, but with the speed of a technology adoption curve nobody in the portrait industry had modeled correctly: the digital camera. By the late 1990s and accelerating hard through the early 2000s, digital cameras dropped in price every single year while improving in quality just as quickly. And crucially, the photographs they produced were free to take. A family no longer had to drive to Sears, dress the children, wait for an appointment slot, and pay for a package of prints just to have a decent picture of their kids. They could take 50 photos in their own living room, delete the 48 that didn't work, and print the 2 that did at a drugstore kiosk for a fraction of a studio sitting's cost. Then came camera phones, and the calculation changed again, this time completely. By the mid-2000s, nearly everyone carried a camera in their pocket at all times. Inside CPI, executives were not blind to what digital photography meant for a business built entirely on being the family's only source of a professional quality photograph. Internal discussions in this period increasingly focused on how to justify the value of a studio sitting when customers could produce serviceable images themselves at no cost. Some in the company argued for leaning into premium, high-touch services that a home camera genuinely could not replicate: better lighting, professional retouching, larger custom prints. Others worried that no amount of repositioning could fully offset a customer base that increasingly saw professional portraits as an occasional luxury rather than an annual ritual. The internal debate was real, but it was also, in hindsight, a company trying to defend a business model against a technological shift that was not going to slow down or reverse course. How long could a company built on being irreplaceable actually survive once the thing that made it irreplaceable became something every family could do for free, at home, whenever they wanted? The studios themselves did not empty out overnight. Sittings still happened. Christmas rushes still filled the appointment books. But the average spending per family, the frequency of repeat visits, and the sheer necessity of the service were all beginning, quietly and without any single dramatic headline, to erode. By the early 2000s, the pressure building inside CPI's boardroom had stopped being a slow, background concern and had become an urgent structural problem. Digital photography had not simply chipped away at the edges of the business, it had struck at the very foundation of what CPI sold. The company's entire model depended on being the only realistic way for an ordinary family to get a professional quality photograph. Once that stopped being true, the studios were left selling something increasingly optional: nostalgia, ceremony, and consistency, in a market that had grown used to getting photographs for free. Executives who had spent their careers inside the portrait business faced a decision that companies in declining industries almost always face eventually and almost never resolve well. Do you retreat and consolidate around a smaller, more loyal customer base willing to pay for genuine quality? Or do you keep the network at its existing size, hoping that scale itself would carry the company through the storm? betting that enough families would still show up out of habit to keep 1,000 studios profitable? CPI, weighed down by debt from decades of acquisitions and diversification into carpet cleaning, upholstery cleaning, and telephone systems, did not have the financial flexibility to make a clean, deliberate choice. Those side businesses, entered during the company's confident years under Alan Esman, were now liabilities rather than hedges, pulling capital and management attention away from the one thing that actually needed reinvestment: the core portrait business itself. Inside individual Sears stores, the effects of this financial strain became visible to the people working the studio floor long before they showed up in any press release. Photographers who had once had access to updated backdrops, working equipment, and enough staff to handle a Saturday rush began describing a slower, quieter decline. Torn backdrops went unreplaced. Broken props sat in storage rather than being swapped out. Staffing levels were cut to the bare minimum needed to keep a studio's doors technically open, which meant longer waits, rushed sittings, and a service that no longer felt like the polished, dependable ritual customers remembered from a decade earlier. For a business that had succeeded for 60 years by being reliable and unhurried, the erosion of that exact quality was corrosive in a way that a single bad headline never could have been. Customers didn't need a scandal to lose faith. They just needed one disappointing visit, compared against the one they remembered from childhood, to quietly decide not to come back next year. The financial pressure compounded further as the company changed hands and changed direction more than once in the 2000s, restructuring under new ownership groups as it searched for a way to stabilize a shrinking core business while carrying debt accumulated during years when portrait photography still looked unstoppable. Employees who had spent years, sometimes decades, working inside the same Sears studio found themselves absorbing the consequences of decisions made far above them, in boardrooms they would never see, by executives responding to spreadsheets rather than to the families sitting in the waiting room every Saturday. Full-time positions were reduced to part-time. Benefits that had once made studio work a genuine long-term job were scaled back. The photographers who remained were, by and large, the ones who genuinely loved the work, a fact that made the eventual outcome even harder for them to accept, because their dedication to the craft had nothing to do with the balance sheet forces closing in around them. And who exactly was supposed to protect the people who had built this business, one Saturday morning, sitting at a time, when the numbers stopped adding up? By the final years before the collapse, the company was searching with increasing urgency for a way out that would not simply mean shutting the doors. Executives approached potential buyers, hoping a larger retail or photography company might see enough residual value in a still massive nationwide footprint to acquire the operation and stabilize it. They approached banks, hoping additional financing could buy enough time to restructure the debt load or fund a genuine transformation of the business model, perhaps around the higher margin, higher quality sittings some inside the company had long argued should have been the strategy all along. Neither effort succeeded. No buyer emerged willing to take on a photography chain with a shrinking customer base and a business model the entire industry understood to be in terminal decline. No bank was willing to extend the kind of support that might have bought the company another few years to find its footing. Inside the company, in the weeks before the end, a small number of senior executives understood, with a clarity most employees and virtually all customers did not yet have, that the business was no longer simply struggling, it was out of options. There was no plan B being quietly assembled, no gradual wind-down being prepared to soften the impact on the tens of thousands of people who still worked inside Sears stores every day, believing they were showing up to a stable, decades-old institution. The company that had once employed traveling cameramen willing to spend a year on the road for the sake of a single-family portrait, the company that had turned Milford Bohm's wartime idea into one of the largest photography operations on Earth, had run out of runway, and almost no one outside a handful of boardrooms knew it yet. What remained was not a strategy for managing the end gracefully. It was simply the end, arriving faster than anyone on the studio floor had been allowed to prepare for. The first public sign that something catastrophic had happened arrived not through a corporate announcement or a press conference, but through confused customers standing in front of locked doors. In early April 2013, without any advance warning to employees, franchise partners, or the millions of families who had appointments booked or portrait packages still waiting to be picked up, CPI Corp abruptly shut down every single one of its studios. Close to 2,000 locations across the United States and Canada, inside both Sears and Walmart stores, went dark within the same week. There was no gradual wind down, no farewell sale, no final season announced in advance to give anyone the chance to say goodbye properly. One week the studios were open, running Saturday sittings exactly as they had for decades. The next, they simply were not. For the employees, the experience was disorienting in a way that few corporate closures managed to be. Photographers arrived for scheduled shifts to find their studios locked, sometimes with no notice beyond a printed sign taped to the glass. Store managers who had worked inside the same Sears location for 10, 15, 20 years learned that their jobs no longer existed, not through a meeting or a phone call from corporate, but by seeing the same closure their customers were seeing. There was no severance conversation, no transition plan, no chance to gather the personal items that had accumulated in a break room over a decade of employment. One day the studio was a functioning part of the store. The next day it was simply gone, and so was the job. The sign that eventually appeared on the company's websites captured the tone of an ending that had clearly been decided in a hurry by people trying to manage a crisis rather than close a chapter with any dignity. It thanked customers for their patronage over the years and noted that anyone with a recent portrait session might still be able to retrieve their images, but only for a short, specific window of time, after which even that thin thread of access would be cut off entirely. For families who had booked a sitting days or weeks earlier, sometimes paying in advance for a package they would now never receive, there was no customer service line prepared to help them, no refund process clearly explained, no path forward beyond a brief, apologetic paragraph on a website that many customers didn't even know to check until they showed up at a locked studio door. CPI's own leadership did not pretend the shutdown was anything other than what it was. In a letter sent to employees as the closures took effect, CEO Jim Abell wrote plainly that the company had been unable to find a buyer and had been unable to secure additional support from its banks, and that the decline of the underlying business had, in his words, proved too great an obstacle to overcome. It was an unusually directed mission for a corporate closure of this scale, and it left little room for the kind of hopeful spin companies often attached to bad news. There was no talk of restructuring, no promise of a leaner comeback, no suggestion that this was anything other than the definitive end of a 70-year-old business. News coverage of the closures arrived quickly, and it captured something the company's own statement had not fully conveyed. How many ordinary people were affected by a shutdown that, on paper, involved a mid-sized photography services company most Americans had never thought about as its own entity? Local news stations across the country ran segments on families discovering their neighborhood studio was gone, some of them holding gift certificates purchased just weeks earlier, others describing decades of annual visits that had simply stopped without explanation. National broadcasts framed the story less as a business failure and more as a cultural marker, evidence of how thoroughly digital photography and smartphone cameras had displaced a ritual that had once seemed as permanent as the mall itself. One widely shared television report described it simply as the end of an era, a phrase that would follow the story through nearly every subsequent retrospective written about the closure. For the families who had spent decades bringing their children to the same studio year after year, the emotional weight of the closure had little to do with the business logic behind it. It was not about market share or digital disruption. It was about the sudden absence of somewhere they had always gone, without ever quite realizing how much they depended on it being there. A mother in one local news interview described standing in front of the locked studio, where she had photographed all three of her children as newborns, holding an appointment card for a sitting that would now never happen, and admitting she hadn't expected to feel as unsettled as she did. It was, after all, just a photography studio, but it had also been the place that held, quite literally, the visual record of her family's most tender years. and now it was simply closed, with no one left inside to explain why. The physical spaces themselves became small, strange monuments to how quickly an institution could disappear. Inside Sears stores across the country, the studio areas sat empty for months, sometimes longer, backdrops still hanging on their rails, sample frames still displayed on the walls, waiting rooms with chairs still arranged for families who would never sit in them again. Sears itself, already struggling with its own broader financial decline, had little urgency or capital to quickly repurpose the abandoned studio space, and so for a long stretch of time, shoppers walking past the old portrait studio simply saw it as it had been left, frozen, unattended, a small, quiet ruin inside a still operating store. There was no liquidation sale for the equipment, no public farewell walkthrough. The doors were locked, and behind them, the machinery of 70 years of family memory making sat untouched, gathering dust in a space that had once been one of the busiest corners of the store. By the time the shock of the closures had worked its way through local news cycles and family group chats, one fact had become clear to almost everyone who had grown up walking through those studio doors. Something that had felt permanent, that had survived war, recession, and the rise of an entirely new visual culture, had ended not with a slow fade, but with a single, silent week in April. And almost no one had gotten the chance to say a proper goodbye. In the months after the closures, the empty studio spaces inside Sears stores became a small but visible symptom of a much larger crisis already engulfing the retailer itself. Sears, already losing customers to big box competitors and increasingly to online shopping, had no urgent plan to repurpose the sudden vacancies left behind by CPI's collapse. In many locations, the studio areas simply sat unused for extended stretches, a quiet corner of a store that was itself shrinking year by year, eventually filled with overflow merchandise, seasonal displays, or nothing at all. There was no single competitor that swept in to claim the customers CPI had lost because there was no longer a business model to inherit. The market for formal, appointment-based family portraiture inside a retail store had not been captured by a rival. It had simply stopped existing at any meaningful scale. A modest revival did eventually emerge, though it never came close to restoring what had been lost. In 2016, a small number of Sears Portrait Studio locations reopened under a new arrangement with Picture People, a company that had weathered its own struggles in the photography industry. The relaunch was limited in scope from the outset, a fraction of the network that had once numbered over 1,000 studios, concentrated in select stores rather than spread nationwide. For the families who found one of these revived studios still operating, the experience offered a flicker of continuity. But the broader ritual, the assumption that a Sears store simply included a portrait studio the way it included a tool department, was gone for good. The revival was a footnote, not a comeback. For the employees who lost their jobs in the April 2013 shutdown, the path forward varied widely and often reflected how transferable their specific skills turned out to be. Photographers with genuine technical expertise sometimes moved into freelance portrait or event photography, building small independent businesses out of the customer relationships and skills they had developed over years inside a CPI studio. Others, particularly store managers whose expertise was more operational than photographic, found the transition harder, entering a job market still recovering from the broader economic disruption of the preceding years. There was no severance package substantial enough to bridge a long gap, and no industry-wide effort to help absorb thousands of suddenly unemployed workers scattered across 2 countries. Many simply found whatever retail or service work was available and moved on, carrying with them years of institutional knowledge about a business that had ceased to need it. The broader lesson of CPI's collapse extended well past the photography industry itself, offering an early and clarifying case study in a pattern that would repeat across American retail throughout the following decade. A business built on being essential can become optional astonishingly fast once technology removes the barrier it once profited from. CPI had not failed because of mismanagement in any conventional sense, or because of a single catastrophic decision. It had failed because the entire premise of its existence, that ordinary families needed someone else to hold the camera, quietly stopped being true and the company's debt load and diversification into unrelated businesses left it with no financial cushion to survive the transition. Industry analysts and retail historians would later point to CPI as one of the clearest early examples of digital disruption, eliminating not just a product category, but an entire category of retail real estate. The small service-based storefront that had once justified a family's trip to the mall in the first place. The communities where CPI studios had operated for decades absorbed a quieter, harder-to-measure loss, alongside the more visible economic one. In small and mid-sized towns where the local Sears had anchored the mall for a generation, the Portrait Studio's disappearance was one more small subtraction from a retail landscape that was already shrinking. One more storefront that would never again be what it once was, even after Picture People's limited revival attempt. What does it mean for a community when the place that quietly held its family memories for 70 years disappears and nothing steps forward to take its place? The empty studio spaces, some of them left untouched for years inside stores that were themselves closing one by one, stood as a strange kind of monument. Not to a scandal and not to a single bad decision, but to how quickly something universally trusted, something that had photographed millions of American children through their entire childhoods, could become obsolete the moment technology gave every family the tools to do it themselves. Somewhere in a shoebox, in an attic, in a drawer nobody has opened in years, there is a photograph of a child sitting on a stool in front of a soft blue backdrop, hands folded the way a photographer once told them to, wearing a shirt that was ironed the night before because the sitting felt like it mattered. The edges are a little worn now. The colors have shifted slightly with age, the way old photographs do. Almost no one remembers the name of the company that took it. They remember the trip to Sears, the wait in the little lobby with the framed samples on the wall, the countdown, the flash, the relief of getting the squirming toddler to hold still for just one more second. They remember more than anything the feeling of it being an occasion, however small, in an otherwise ordinary week. That feeling was the entire business, long before anyone called it a business model. Milford Boehm understood it in 1942, sending a young man out into the Kansas countryside with a camera and a tank of gasoline, because he knew that even in the middle of a war, a family would find a way to pay for the chance to hold on to a face they were afraid of losing. Alan Esman understood it decades later, building that instinct into a 1,000-store partnership with the largest retailer in the country, turning an errand into a ritual that grandmothers and mothers and daughters would repeat year after year, without ever quite noticing they were repeating it. What both men were really selling was never the print itself. It was the pause. The one Saturday morning a year when a family stopped moving long enough to be looked at, together, on purpose. It mattered because so little else in an ordinary life asks a family to do that. Nobody schedules an appointment to simply be seen. The Sears Portrait Studio did, and it did it without pretension, without the formality or expense of a professional photographer hired for a wedding or a milestone anniversary. It met families exactly where they were, in a mall on a Saturday, between the tool aisle and the appliance floor, and it made the ordinary act of documenting a childhood feel accessible to almost anyone, regardless of income or occasion. For families who couldn't afford elaborate portraits any other way, it was often the only professional photograph they would ever own of a particular year, a particular stage, a particular version of a child who would not stay that age for long. It gave working-class families the same access to a polished, dignified family portrait that had once belonged only to those who could afford a private photographer. And in doing so, it quietly wrote itself into the visual history of an entire generation. What disappeared in April 2013 was not simply a chain of photography studios. It was a small, dependable ritual that had asked nothing extraordinary of anyone, only that they show up, sit still, and let themselves be captured exactly as they were that year. No other business ever fully replaced it because the thing it offered was never really about the photograph. It was about the pause before the photograph. The moment a family stood together and looked at a lens instead of at their phones, at each other instead of at whatever else was pulling their attention that week. The world moved on. Cameras got smaller, then disappeared into pockets entirely, and families learned to document themselves without anyone else's help. But somewhere, in an old frame on a wall or a faded print tucked into a photo album, the evidence of that 70-year ritual remains. A whole country's worth of ordinary Saturdays quietly saved.